Hello, my name is Raquel García Llorente. I am an analyst at Elcano Royal Institute. And first of all, on behalf of Elcano and of TEPSA, I would like to thank you very much for being here today with us and for showing your interest in this event. For us, it has been a real honor to see how much interest this event has drawn. The aim of this activity in the eve of the Spanish Presidency of the Council of the European Union is to bring together high-level decision makers, experts, and also the civil society in order to analyze the priorities and the challenges of the upcoming semester. Today, we open a 2-day discussion where we want to talk and to discuss about all the dossiers that are going to be on the table during this Spanish presidency. And a lot of things come to my mind: energy market, fiscal rules, the enlargement dossier. So I don't want to take a lot of time of you. I just wanted to remind you that this event has been co-organized by Elcano, which is the leading Spanish think tank here in Spain on international affairs and strategic affairs, and also one of the leading think tanks in Europe and in the world, and also by TEPSA, the Trans-European Policy Studies Association, which is the first European research network in the field of European affairs. Finally, this event has also been co-organized by the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, Stubb. Thank you very much, and supported by the Spanish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation, and by the representation of the European Commission here in Spain. Thank you very much. So, without further delay, I would like to proceed with the opening remarks. So let me introduce you, first of all, to José Juan Ruiz, who is the chairman of the Elcano Royal Institute. So, José Juan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raquel. Thank you, everybody, to be here. It's really an honor to receive you in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I want to thank the Ministry for all their help in trying to organize this meeting. It has been really great. And I think we have 2 days in front of us to discuss very, very important topics. And I'm looking forward to hear and to listen to what you have to say. I'm an economist. That's as a disclaimer in front of all of you. I believe in catching up. We are 10 minutes later. My 2-cent contribution is to keep this remark very, very short. I think I have made the best to welcome all of you here. Therefore, let's start. Let's begin our discussion. I am completely sure that we are going to have very interesting discussion. And thanks again for being in Madrid, for having accepted the invitation of the Real Instituto Elcano to be here to discuss and to create a better Europe. Thank you, everybody.
Now let me introduce you to Lucía Mocrà, who is the chairperson of the board of TEPSA. Please, Lucía. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy and honored to be here on the name and on behalf of TEPSA. I would like to welcome all who are present here and also online. Let me firstly thank to the organizers, Elcano and Stubb, as the institutes who are the partners and members and associate member of the TEPSA network, and also the Ministry for hosting us, for having us in this wonderful time of the year, but on the other side, very challenging time of the year and of the order at all. Let me point in these introductory remarks some points we will discuss throughout the conference, which are very crucial for the incoming months of the presidency. The Spain is going to hold. And which will shape also the order of the discussions, not only today and tomorrow, but also in incoming 6 months. And I know that Spain is a very valued member, a long-standing member of the European Union, having the experience with the presidency, but still we are living in unpredictable time where the rule-based order we had been relying on is in a stake, is challenging. And in this way, it is very important for the European Union to hear the experts' voices, to create all the decisions based on the evidence, and to move very strategically and in unified way forward. Why in unified way? I mean, we can have a diversity in opinions, but always, as the European Union, we have to present them in one standing and in one voice. Because the European Union had been always the leader and always the eager to go beyond the limits which had been stated on the global level. We can see it in for example, digitalization, in just green transition, when the European Union was pushing forward and inspiring also the other countries and the other leaders to move forward a little bit quickly. And one of the priority of the Spanish presidency, which had been held for a long time there, is the social policy and building something what we call social fortress Europe, where we can rely not only on the economic profit and benefit, but we always think about the people who are creating the European Union and which are in the center of the policies itself. And I'm not going to speak too long, but I would like to conclude with one very important thing. If we would not stick united in this kind of a diversity, if we would not stick in our values, we can be, as our Slovak former minister and current the ambassador for the dialogue between Pristina and Kosovo said, the issue is that not where the EU is moving and developing, but the question is whether EU will be on the table or at the table in the incoming years. I believe that we will be still a very important actor, and we will have to say something also to addressing the current challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia. Now, Carmen Colomina, please come to the stage. She is Senior Research Fellow at the Barcelona Center for International Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I first have to excuse my director, Paul Morillas, who had to be here, but last-minute arrangements prevent him to come. So I will step in his shoes. So I can only think, or I can only thank from Stubb Elcano for offering us to participate in the coordination, to be a member of this Pre-Presidency Conference. Of course, to thank and to value TEPSA for our associate membership, which is always important also in our research, to the Ministry for opening the doors to all of us to discuss here. And Jose Juan made a disclaimer. I will have to do my own because I started as a journalist. I'm sorry. But I couldn't be more agree with TEPSA when we just focus on the importance of narratives, on the importance of truth, on having a communication strategy proactive, because for a long time the EU has been so reactive. In the last years we have learned how to deal with crisis management, but now we have to go beyond. We have to start changing also policies, to changing approaches, and a lot of that will be discussed today and tomorrow, and a lot of that also will be determined by what is happening beyond EU's borders, what will happen in Ukraine, how are we going to deal with new allies, how are we going to improve our relations, not only with Latin America, but with all this new regionalism that is coming back and coming back strong as a way to face these new global powers. So thank you very much to all of you, and just to wish a very enlightening discussion for all of us in the next years. Thank you.
Now I would like to give the floor to Juan González Mellizo, Head of Communication of the representation of the European Commission here in Spain.
Good afternoon, and from the representation of the European Commission in Spain, we are very, very grateful to be part of this, to have had this opportunity from Elcano, from the Ministry, from all the organizers, to be a tiny, tiny part of this big universe of ideas, reflection on a discussion that couldn't be more timely. From our point of view, you know how important this presidency is from the Commission point of view. This is the last one that will be complete, the last before the next political cycle. So what we would like to have is as many legislative files closed, but it is not only about closing files, it's about getting the best possible agreement. So it's not a question of numbers, it's a question of quality. And here, the presidency has a fundamental role. So here we are in the Commission, not deciding anything in this period, but trying to support the presidency and the Parliament to get the best possible agreement. And from the substance, it's wonderful to have Elcano and all this type of events to help us going through that. I think the program reflects very well all the priorities that are the priorities not of the European Commission, but the European Union as a whole. Maybe I would mention one that I don't see in the program, but I'm sure it will come up during the discussions today, and it's the budget, the money. Commissioner Hahn, responsible for budget, is precisely today in Madrid, preparing already the next multi-annual financial framework, the revision that the presidency will have to deal with, because it is not only with legislation, but also with funding that we can face the challenge of Ukrainian and Russian war and many other issues that we have on the table. I'm finishing also disclaimer. I work in communication, and I think that the presidency is a wonderful opportunity to communicate here in Spain what the European Union does, not only for stakeholders, not only for businesses, not only for academia, but also for citizens. Thank you for your attention and enjoy the conference.
Thank you very much. And finally, I would like to give a warm welcome to María Lledó. She's the Secretary General for the European Union at the Spanish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation. Thank you, María.
So, dear friends, for us it's a pleasure to host you here in this ministry. This event is very much important for us. So, without a doubt, the TEPSA network is the most relevant in terms of research on European affairs, so it's a pleasure to have you here for these 2 days. We will listen to your ideas and proposals for the next semester. In fact, we have already done so somehow, because we already have read with interest the recommendations for the presidency of the TEPSA network that you published a few days ago. The Spanish presidency efforts do not start on July the 1st, but it's been a very long process that we have been preparing for almost 2 years. This presidency is a nationwide project, highly enriched by the contributions of every actor, such as the autonomous communities, the Spanish Parliament as a whole, and a strong involvement of the Spanish civil society. So your contributions, it's what we're expecting now, and they're really very precious to us. The Spanish presidency of the Council of the European Union will be a unique opportunity to show how Spain can defend the European project, and we are going to show how, what we have to offer to this European project. It will be, as you know, the 5th time in which Spain assumes this leadership position since its integration into the European project in 1986. We are a big member state of the Union, and one of the most, and I would like to underline this very much, one of the most pro-European countries, so we take on this challenge with determination. Given that it will be a closing presidency before the end of this EU legislature, the 6-month period aims to conclude a large number of legislative dossiers. We therefore have an institutional responsibility ahead of us as an honest broker to bring positions closer and move the European Union forward. These dossiers are of utmost importance for European citizens, such as the European Health Union, the revision of fiscal government rules, or the reform of the electricity market. All this without forgetting that we need to look towards a broader political horizon. Preserving the unity of the member states in support of Ukraine is fundamental in this regard, because Europe has everything at stake in this war. This unity is precisely what we are witnessing today in Moldova at the summit of the European Political Community, or in Vilnius at the meeting of NATO Foreign Minister, where, by the way, my minister is. You already know many of the milestones of the Spanish presidency on which we have been working for a long time. The EU Select Summit that will be held in July will be of great importance for both Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean countries, as we share fundamental values and geostrategic interest. So Spain aims to consolidate an agenda for the future, establishing a structured and permanent dialogue that we will strengthen the bi-regional relationship. Also, the Informal European Council, to be held on the 4th and 5th October in Granada, or the next summit, of course, of the European Political Community, which will also be held in Granada, back to the Informal Council. It will be a presidency that places the European people at the center of its policies through the conclusion and advancement of the many dossiers we will seek to improve the daily lives of European citizens. So, in conclusion, we are ready to face the challenge because of the preparatory work which we have been carrying out for almost 2 years, enriched by the contribution of every actor, the diplomatic muscle on which the Spanish presidency will rely, the support of a clearly pro-European society. So we assume the presidency of the Council with confidence and determination, and we will devote all our efforts to continue building the European project. Thanks very much, and welcome to this headquarters.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. So if you agree, let's move directly to the plenary session. So I ask to come to the stage to Marí, Klose, and to Richard Jones, please. Okay, so thank you very much. Let's start with the plenary session, which we have called the Spanish EU Presidency, Challenges and Priorities in the Aftermath of the Pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In this plenary session, we want to discuss the complex context in which the Spanish presidency is taking place. This Spanish presidency is the last one complete in the current European institutional period, so this is the last one complete before the European elections in 2024. And this institutional period has been deeply marked by two major and unprecedented crises. First, the pandemic, and later, the Russian aggression on Ukraine. So there's no doubt that the Spanish presidency is inheriting the consequences of these two major emergencies. And as I mentioned before, a lot of important dossiers come to my mind. So I think we can agree that the success of this semester will depend on the ability of the Spanish presidency to move forward on these important issues that are now on the center of the agenda: the reform of fiscal rules, the energy market, as I mentioned before. However, I think that it's important not to look only at the consequences of the past, but also we should try to look ahead. And what I mean, I'm thinking about the complex international scenario in which, based on a much more geopolitical and geostrategic competition among great powers, in which the European Union should find its place, should define its relation with those great powers, and also should try to redefine its wide range of different policies, industry, technology, in much more strategic terms. And all this can be framed in this idea of open strategic autonomy, which is supposed to be one of the main priorities of the Spanish presidency too. In this sense, however, it is said that the rotating presidency has seen reduced its clout. However, I think that its importance shouldn't be dismissed either, because I think that the Spanish presidency could be seen as an opportunity for both the European Union and for Spain. On the one hand, for the European Union, Spain is a much more pro-European and reliable country, a reliable European member state, has proven that it can be an ambitious and a proactive member state, which is able to develop different alliances within the EU, but also is able to help to build stronger alliances with strategic partners in the world, for example, Latin America. And on the other hand, the presidency itself is also an opportunity for Spain, for many reasons, for trying to consolidate this influence, this greater influence that we have seen previous years, and also to draw attention toward the South at a time when the center of gravity has shifted to the East. So a lot of questions come up to my mind, and I'm sure that to yours too. So let's start with a terrific panel. Here we have two great speakers, Marí Klose, who is the former chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Congress of Deputies of Spain, and also Richard Youngs, who works as senior fellow at Carnegie Europe. And we will also have another speaker online, Alexander Stubb, former Prime Minister of Finland, and now the director of the School of Transnational Governance. So let's start with the first round of interventions, where I would like to ask you to give us your thoughts of this complex scenario that I described and the challenges that you think that Spain is going to face. So please, Pau, start whenever you want. Thank you.
Thank you, Raquel. Thank you very much to TEPSA and Elcano for this invitation. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to join this exciting event. The first thing that pops into my mind, of course, is that we are facing a long-during crisis. It was Jean Monnet, I think, that said that Europe will be forged in time of crisis, and it can be fairly said that that we are undergoing dramatic test that has been started years ago, started with the Great Recession, of course, that lasted 4 years or more than 4 years in some cases. Next, we had a pandemic, an unexpected pandemic that lasted 2 years, and now we have crossed, the first year of a war in Ukraine that is having, dramatic consequences in Ukraine, but also like collateral effects of all kinds of collateral effects, mainly economic, of course, in many countries. But it's safe to say that, that there are political consequences that we are also experiencing these days, political consequences with great, unrest and contestation in some countries in the streets, with loss of, strengthness of some governments, ruling coalition governments in other countries, and with electoral defeats of ruling parties in Italy, recently in Spain. So we are facing a huge test that began a long time ago, a decade ago, with the Great Recession that led to, significant changes in, policies of the European Union. We have suspended fiscal rules after the pandemic. We constructed or we strengthened like the social pillar. We approved or we passed extraordinary funds with the Recovery and Resilience Plan. We coordinated, actions with the pandemic. We purchased jointly vaccines. So, Monet was right to a certain extent. So we are facing now an atypical crisis, and this atypical situation is obviously leading to an acceleration of many processes and to reconsider a lot of things. So for instance, and we are trying to search labels for this interregnum, has also been called. Macron spoke of the end of innocence. Scholz brought to the fore this concept of Zeitenwende. So we are well aware that we are reconsidering a lot of things, and this is like somehow creating a, we will be all the time using like these tags, these labels, like a geopolitical awakening that I think it was Borrell who mentioned it first. So, and this geopolitical kind of awakening is, somehow precipitated by the war in Ukraine. But it is predated by other processes that began, long time ago. So, Ukraine is key in this acceleration of the process of rethinking our settlement in the world, our relations with the vicinity, our capacity to forge new alliances in this turbulent period. And this is something that we need to acknowledge. I remember I was in Kyiv, in the first anniversary of the war, and I had the opportunity to meet a lot of parliamentarians, and I felt the need to acknowledge and thank Ukraine for somehow, accelerating this process of rethinking. So somehow Ukraine, the resistance, the courage, the determination to fight for a rules-based order, to fight for the territorial integrity, makes us better, makes us, more conscious, more aware of, dangers, threats that we face. And, these threats had already been identified, as I said before. There were intellectuals, there were experts, there were political actors warning about geostrategical turbulences before February 22 of last year. But there was a strong reluctance to deal with these challenges and to take on, particularly to take on the cost of reform and change. So if you review what was going on, debates about increasing defense spending predates the war in Ukraine. Borrell's strategic compass was forged earlier. The pandemic impelled us to think about the need to equip ourselves with industries that produce critical goods. There were experts who were warning about the risk that dependencies, might at some point turn against us. There were experts even warning about, Russia as a threat. as a threat because it could at some point manage the dependencies for their benefit and against our interests. So the concept of strategic autonomy was already there. You know, it predates the war in Ukraine. There was research on hybrid threats, particularly on the use of migration to blackmail us. So cyber security was already a concern a long time ago, I would say at least a decade ago. So, you know, we talked about, you know, Russia as a threat. We did particularly in Spain because, but, you know, at a very constrained moment, you know, as we realized that Russia was somehow involved in the nationalist movement of independence in Catalonia. So our awareness of threat was already there. Somehow, you know, the focus, you know, changed, but, you know, there was already some sort of geopolitical awakeness at that point. But the war in Ukraine brings all this to a new scenario, a scenario in which some of the kind of collective dilemmas that we faced are suddenly more likely to be resolved, more likely to be overcome, more likely to be addressed. So you know, we are more likely to turn our thinking or our rethinking about threats, risks, opportunities into concrete actions. So free riding is less legitimate than it was in the past, and somehow actors are able to, you know, press others to, you know, joint collective efforts. So I finish with that. The primary responsibility of Spain during this semester, I would say, is to maintain this spirit of cooperation and this spirit of unity, and take the advantage to bring, you know, this spirit to other issues, to other realms, not directly related to the war in Ukraine, and not even only related to, you know, our defense and security concerns. So there are other fields in which the Spanish authorities they want to work on, and where we need to reach, you know, broad agreements. I particularly see the Migration and Asylum Pact or the relationship with Latin America as big priorities in which we need to build broader coalitions. So, but let's take advantage of this broad consensus that we have attained, you know, in confronting, you know, the aggression of Russia in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you very much, Pau. So now, Richard, I ask you the same question. Please wait. What are your thoughts about this scenario and the Spanish presidency?
Very, very similar, actually. First of all, Raquel, thanks to you, Nacho, Charles, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I think my general opening reflections go very much in the same direction, quite so I can be very brief. I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of individual policy priorities, but if we're talking here about context, for me, the big question is really how this successive sense of crisis is basically restructuring the context within which the European project is developing and within which the Spanish presidency has to function. This is a presidency that will be dominated by crisis. We know from events on the ground, unfortunately, the crisis is likely to become more challenging during the course of the presidency. Things could get a lot more severe. Therefore, I think it is a presidency that will be dominated by this framing, this narrative of crisis containment or crisis stabilization. We know that in a way this isn't novel. We are in an era of perma-crisis. There are people in the room who have been writing about this academic concept of perma-crisis that it is becoming the basic default new normal that determines the way that the European project progresses. Monet was right that Europe is forged in crisis, but it seems to me conceptually it's a bit more complicated than that, because these successive crises are imbuing the European project with many strengths, but also many weaknesses as well. And I think, so there is good and bad in the unity and the kind of advances in European integration that the crises are impelling. And I think in this way, this is kind of the challenge that the Spanish presidency has to deal with. The presidency itself is not going to resolve these big issues, but I think just as a framing, the big cross-cutting issue that I would put on the table is that the challenge will be to manage these short-term immediate crises, but to keep in mind, or at least without forgetting, that there are these broader structures to the European project that also need to be dealt with and not completely forgotten. I think the war in this sense is a double-edged sword. It clearly has been a catalyst for many new areas of European unity and deeper integration. I would say also it's distracting European governments from strategizing or thinking, at least on some elements of European cooperation, from thinking about deeper reform to the European project and strategizing over the longer term. It's understandable that that is the case, perhaps because the imperatives, the immediate imperatives of the war are so serious. But I do think that those longer term questions of where the European project is heading, what are the basic structures of integration, do need to be kept in mind, because it seems to me that the war requires a paradigm shift to the whole model of European cooperation, not simply a few sporadic elements of policy advances or advances in individual policy fields. And I think as yet, the European governments have not really caught up with the really deep underlying structural changes that are needed, commensurate with the challenge that the war presents. I think there's a lot to say in this, but I would just at this stage put one issue on the table, which is that if we think beyond all these individual policy priorities, and I could just list all the areas of policies that are likely to be important. For me, the big cross-cutting challenge that the Spanish presidency, European governments have to deal with is what's the narrative, what's the storyline linking all these different policy challenges together. And it seems to me the EU doesn't really have that clear at the moment. For me, it's this. I think we're entering an era of much more complicated, multi-level European cooperation. It's true that the crisis is forging new areas of European coordination, but this coordination is not, it seems to me, taking place in accordance with any single uniform institutional template. It's involving lots of different models of cooperation, different actors. It's shifting power between different institutions in very complex and uncertain ways. So I don't think in the future we're likely to see one uniform model of integration. We're seeing a lot of transfer of power to the supranational level, a lot of kind of supranational centralism, as it might be called, some more looser coordination between member states, some cooperation taking place through kind of mini groupings between member states, new initiatives coming into being completely outside the framework of the European Union. It seems to me this is the future. People here have been writing about this in a much more multivariate model of European cooperation. I think the war is likely to intensify this dynamic a lot. Managing that for a presidency, I think, will be a lot more complicated. It seems to me, therefore, the presidency has to be, unfortunately for Spain, about a lot more than the normal, formal, standard model of managing the EU agenda. I would suggest that, and I'll leave it at this, that perhaps Spain can pioneer this model of the presidency playing more of a bridging role between all these different sites and centers of cooperation, and, however challenging it is, trying to bridge these short-term imperatives with these longer-term structural changes. I think we'll perhaps unpack these a bit in a minute. But if I had to say there was one really challenging narrative cutting across all these different policy areas, for me it would be that.
Okay. Thank you very much to all of you for your interesting thoughts and especially for sticking to your time. now it was supposed to be the turn of Alexander Stubb, but I think that as we are so well in time, maybe we can start with a second round, and then we can talk with him. Just to a brief question, a brief answer by yours, please, Pau. I would like to ask you, what do you expect, or what should we expect for the Spanish presidency in the foreign arena? Is Spain going to be able to build stronger alliances with other partners? Because before you mentioned Latin America, so if you want to deepen in this regard.
Well, there are big dossiers out there. There are dossiers related to, fostering this concept of strategic autonomy, like taking it beyond, this focus strictly on like defense and security issues, like basically bringing it to take into consideration, dimensions that, we have learned that are also very important. So dimensions that are related to industry, that are related to technology, that are related to the access to critical materials, to critical minerals, that are related to health provision. We learned a lot about that during the pandemic. So basically, we need to do a lot of work, in this field of these foreign relations to move forward in making possible this kind of open strategic autonomy. So particularly on this dossier on Latin America, this is going to be like a big dossier, where I think, you mentioned this capacity of Spain, or this potential of Spain of having like this bridging role. And this is, probably more obvious than in any other dossier with this relation with Latin America. So we will be obviously working on it, because we have a strong feeling in Spain that Latin America in these new scenarios is the natural coalition partner of the European Union. So, we are seeing growing polarization, and at the same time, we feel that Latin America is going to stand, to stick to the same positions, broadly to the same positions that we are likely to hold. So, there is obviously this idea that in these new global scenarios, we'll need stronger bonds with Latin America. Because, when you face uncertainties, when you face threats, you want to have as many reliable partners, like-minded partners as possible. And Latin America, beyond, our European allies, is obviously the first candidate to become, our partner. So we need to strengthen our economic cooperation with Latin America. There is this big dossier of the strategic agreement of Mercosur, other agreements with Chile, with Mexico, but we aim to go beyond. So there are other areas in which we need to strengthen the relationship. Fields related to, obviously, energetic transition. Latin America is the continent of sun and water, and these are becoming key resources in these new worlds. There are dossiers to strengthen cooperation on digitalization, artificial intelligence, education and culture. Keep in mind that Spain, obviously, but not only Spain, but also Portugal, share languages with Latin American countries. And, you know, languages facilitate interaction, facilitate communication, facilitate, you know, to build bonds that are still based on personal relations. But beyond that, you know, languages are also resources in the new economy. And this is something that Spain is realizing. We have, you know, a commissioner that is working on this particular issue, the potential that language has in economic development, particularly related to the use of the language in the development of new technology, especially artificial intelligence. The ChatGPT needs, you know, language resources, and we have a language that we don't want to be kept aside in this competition for, you know, bringing new technologies to work with information. So, you know, we need to work on building relationships with allies, in reaching out for a second reason, and I leave it, will leave it there. If we don't do it, others will not hesitate to do it. You know, we are in a dynamic of competition with other countries in Latin America, particularly China. China is playing a big role, economic role in Latin America. It's becoming a trading partner. It's becoming the first investor in many countries. And you know, who knows what comes next? So in this new global scenario, the EU cannot afford to become isolated, to lose, you know, these privileged ties that Europe can build with Latin America, and that I think Spain can help to forge or to strengthen with the continent.
Thank you. If I may, because I was listening to you and several questions came up to my mind. The first one is, yes, of course, we all agree that we want to strengthen our relations with Latin America, but do we have them on board? What do you think? Do you have some views on that? Are they really willing to develop stronger relations with us? Because with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have seen that maybe not all of us are on the same page. So that would be the first question. And then I wanted to touch upon China, as you mentioned it. What kind of relations should we have with this great power?
I might need another 10 minutes there.
Take the time that you want, don't worry.
Especially for the last question. But I would say, you know, in this world, we cannot afford to limit ourselves to work with, you know, with our closest partners in terms of values, principles, in terms of visions of the world. So, you know, we have to take some risk in dealing with countries that, you know, might not meet all the standards that we ask for our closest partners. And that might not meet not only like standards in terms of rules, but also standards in terms of respect for rules, in terms of sharing, you know, all our values all the time. So we have to tolerate some differences. And of course, Latin America is a region on we play in the safe side. So there are differences, of course, and we have seen them, and they might deepen if we don't, you know, intervene, if we don't get involved. They might deepen. So, but still, Latin America is a continent where we have a lot of democracies. You know, democracies that sometimes, you know, might be defective in particular dimensions, but are still committed to democracy. And these are resilient democracies. These are democracies that last over time. We might not had, we were not able to say that a decade ago or 2 decades ago, in which democracies were weak. At this point, we can say that democracies withstand turbulences and are able to prevail at the end. So that makes Latin America, along with the Balkans, along with particular countries that have been able to withstand these turbulences, but the perfect candidate to be an ally in the long run. And that doesn't mean that we can take that for granted. We need to work. There are competitors in Latin America, and these competitors are influencing local politics and are building strong ties with political elites, with economic elites in these countries. And we also know that Russia is acting in Latin America in terms of particularly disinformation campaigns that often turn some of the constituencies against these shared values. So we cannot afford ourselves to stand isolated in Europe and avoid reaching out particularly to these countries that are candidates to have like the closest visions of the world.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we already have him. Okay, so I don't know. Hello, Alexander Stubb, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay.
Interesting conversation.
Thank you very much for being with us here today. I already introduced you, but I'm going to do it again. We have the pleasure to have with us Alexander Stubb. He is the director of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute and former Prime Minister of Finland. We wanted you to talk us about what do you think about this complex scenario in which the Spanish presidency is taking place and the challenges ahead. So whenever you want, the floor is yours.
Sure. No, thanks a lot. And sorry, I can only be with you for the allotted 15 minutes. So first of all, very honored for the invitation, much appreciated. And my presidency memories go back to 1999 when I was the deputy and teaching during the Finnish presidency. And I remember preparing that presidency, and one of the wisdoms I think we brought forward at the time, I think still holds. And this could be my core message to the Spanish presidency, is that it's not the presidency that makes the agenda, it's the agenda that makes the presidency. So usually what happens in these situations is that the administration gets prepared and prepares 3, 4, 5, or 6 so-called priorities, but those priorities usually fly out of the window because of European or global events. And I must say, I guess in Spain, because of domestic events as well, because from what I understand, you'll start your presidency with elections. The good news is that the presidency, I think, is always super exciting for the country and the administration in question, because you get a chance to show what you can do, and you also kind of force the administration to focus on European affairs. The other side of the coin, of course, is that nowadays the big presidencies are permanent and run by individuals, and that means that the European Council has a permanent president in the form of Charles Michel. The Eurogroup has a permanent president in the form of Pascal Donahue, and of course the Foreign Affairs Council has a permanent president in the form of Josep Borrell. And of course those are the sort of 3 big councils that you end up dealing with. Having said that, let me give you a few points of where I think the context of the Spanish presidency takes place. It's easy for me to say nowadays as an academic, but to be honest, I do think that if you look at the global situation, this is pretty much the 1919, 1945, or 1989 moment of our generation. And by that I mean to say that in 1919, when World War I had ended, the leaders of the time tried to prevent war by creating the League of Nations. Good objectives, but of course, as we all know, with the wisdom of hindsight, it failed and World War II emerged. In 1945, the lessons had been learned and a system of international governance, which we otherwise know as the liberal world order, was created on the ruins of World War II. And that basically meant that you had rules, norms, and international institutions which contained big power conflict, namely the tension and potential global war between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies. And of course, in 1989 or 1991, if you want to use the collapse of the Soviet Union as your starting date, when the Cold War ended, we moved from a bipolar world to a unipolar world and sort of thought that the whole world would convert to Fukuyama's thesis of the end of history, which basically meant that all 200 countries or nation states in the world would divert or converge towards some kind of a combination of the best form of governance, which is liberal democracy, market economy, and globalization. Now, I would argue that the Spanish presidency starts at a time where all of this has been kind of thrown out of the window, not only because of 9/11 or because of the financial crisis or the asylum crisis or because of Trump or because of Brexit or because of COVID, but because of the war that we have in Europe. And in that sense, it comes at a super interesting time. I'm not saying that the Spanish presidency is going to solve the new world order, nor that it is going to solve and muster peace in Ukraine. But I do think that the timing is as important as it gets. And of course, when a big country inside the European Union and a mid-sized power globally takes the helm of the most successful multilateral institution in the world, namely the European Union, that always does have, I think, importance. Now, may I give sort of three humble recommendations to the Spanish presidency? And the previous speaker was touching upon one of them a little bit. My first recommendation is that the Spanish presidency would try to drive what I call a dignified foreign policy. And by this, I mean to say that when we're looking at the global order in the making, I think the global West stands to lose a lot. And the reason for that is that we are seen as arrogant, as colonialist, and in some cases, imperialist, moralizing preachers. The best way in which I've heard it explained was by, I think, a Kenyan minister who said, every time China comes to Kenya, we get a hospital. Every time the West comes to Kenya, we get a lecture. So take an approach and follow the line, I think, of Josep Borrell, where you take a dignified foreign policy. The thesis of my book is pretty much that we're going to have three power centers. One is the global West, 50 of us. We want to preserve the liberal world order. The second one, and the other extreme, is the global East, which is China, Russia, Iran, and 22 other countries, so 25. They want to break the global order. And then the third one is the global South, 125 countries, and they are actually the ones who are going to decide the global order and what it looks like. So take a humble, dignified approach to foreign policy. And of course, you have a competitive advantage, if I may, in Latin America and in convincing some of the Latin American countries to be as close to Europe as possible. I'll be very frank with you. My president Sauli Niinistö is currently visiting Brazil and President Lula. And I don't feel very comfortable with the line that Lula has taken, for instance, in the war in Ukraine. So if you can convince your Latin American friends in a dignified way to be on the side of the global West in the war in Ukraine, I think that's a very good beginning. Number two, work on the internal cohesion of the European Union. And by that, I mean to say that as an EU nerd, I've never seen the European Union more unified than it has been during the war, in terms of sanctions, in terms of political declarations, in terms of financial aid, in terms of military aid, in terms of weapons, you name it. We have been as unified as we possibly can get. And this, of course, is because there is nothing that unites you more than a common enemy, and in this particular case, Vladimir Putin. But you see, this unity is going to start to crumble. You're already starting to see some war fatigue in some countries. There might be some movement happening around, but you need to contain that. You need to work on that a lot together, of course, with the European institutions, with Ursula von der Leyen, with Josep Borrell, with Charles Michel, etc. Spain is very good at diplomacy, and you can mediate and help and sort out and find compromises. You have to be quite unselfish on this, and sometimes, of course, do things that are not up the line of what you would usually do. But the internal cohesion of the European Union in this particular situation, I think, is very important. What I keep on saying about foreign policy cohesion is that when you're a foreign minister, which I have been in Finland, when you're a foreign minister, the whole country wants you to succeed, right? But when you are the high representative of the EU, a lot of EU countries want you to fail because they are trying to drive their own foreign policy. So if you can help, Borrell as much as you possibly can, regardless of what the next government coalition is going to be like in Spain, I think that's very important in trying to maintain the cohesion, because you have to understand that the security situation in Europe is semi-permanent. So we will see a division, or we have seen a division in Europe where Russia is isolated from the West, not the rest, but from the West. And on the other side of the new Iron Curtain, we have the European Union. And if we want to play into the hands of Putin, then we're split. But if we're unified, I think we keep it together. The third piece of advice I want to give is that please try to fight for the internal market and the basic economic values that the European Union stands for. I am very worried that the spirit that we had in 1989, or right after the accession of Spain into the European Union, which was pretty much about market, not state, is now being completely reversed. Remember the 1990s, where the Single European Act in 1986-87, they were the heyday of the four freedoms: free movement of goods, services, people, and money. They were the heyday of increasing qualified majority voting and competence in trade policy. They were the heyday of European competition policy. And these three pillars, which I think are the foundation of our economic welfare, which then has led to the support of European welfare states, they are now under attack. All of this talk about strategic autonomy or protecting industries. I'm not naming a country here, but the one that I mean. I think it's extremely dangerous. Going into state aid, which basically benefits two of the biggest countries in the European Union, those kinds of elements have to be, I think, fought back. So I think, and I'm happy to take questions, but I think that the Spanish presidency, as I said, it's not the agenda that makes, it's not the president that makes the agenda, it's the agenda that makes the president. You have a lot of big tickets on the agenda in the coming year. You're going to be dealing with energy union. You're going to be dealing with exporting ammunition. You're going to be dealing with new fiscal rules. You're going to be dealing with the possible mutualization of debt, especially when it comes to financing the war in Ukraine. You're going to be dealing with solidarity funds, etc., etc. All of them very difficult to sort of find compromises on. But I'm sure that the Spanish presidency, with its experience, can certainly grind these things through. So good luck with it, and I'm more than happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for your insightful thoughts, and thank you also for offering yourself for answering questions. I don't know if there is any question in the room, someone who wanted to react or ask anything. Here, Charles. Yes, sorry. Charles is the director of the Elcano Royal Institute, and he wanted to
Thank you very much, Alexander. It's wonderful to see you, even if it isn't in the flesh. And thank you for that excellent advice. I'm just a bit worried about the fact that you've taken on board this concept of the Global South. I've recently come back from Chile, and they find this concept deeply offensive. Because what they argue is that, I'm sure you're familiar with this wonderful piece in The Economist, the transactional 25 economies, 127 economies in the world, countries in the world have not applied sanctions on Russia. But that doesn't mean that we should lump them together. And my fear is that if we continue to talk about the Global South, we will create something that doesn't actually exist. And the Chileans in particular were saying, look, we have nothing to do with a lot of these countries that you're lumping us together with. We are basically Western. But we are transactional, and amusingly, when they kept asking us, are you just here for our lithium? So we need to prove, I think, to many of these what I would prefer to call emerging economies, that we as Europeans are interested in them in their own right, not because. Paul, I would be critical of one of the remarks you made in that regard, not because if we're not there, then the Chinese will be there. No, we want to be there because we are Europeans, because we believe in the EU as a credible global actor. So I'm just a little bit concerned that if we continue to use this label, we will also reinforce the notion of the West versus the rest. I'm happy that Mr. Putin calls us the collective West, because yes, that's what we are in this war. But I'm less happy with the use of the Global South as a label. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's a very good point. To a certain extent, I'll cause you a disappointment, but I'll explain why. And the reason I cause it is that the book that I'm working on is called The New World Disorder. And in that book, I'm trying to make sense of what's going on and how the tectonic plates in the world are shifting. And the big thesis is that we will be witnessing a world of many different orders. And I would argue that many of them are going to be regional. So that means that we're going to have a Latin American order. We might have a North American order. We obviously have a European order. We might have an Asian order, an African order. But on top of that, you have these overarching alliances, which, most of the time are actually, to be very blunt, transactional. I mean, the example that I give is BRICS. I mean, what is the binding glue of BRICS? Well, nothing really, except that an economist in the form of Jim O'Neill wrote a book about Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa as emerging economies. Now, you might have seen an op-ed that I wrote in the Financial Times a couple of weeks back. The original title of it was "The Global South is going to decide the new world order." Now, of course, when you write an op-ed, the FT decides what the headline is. So it was more along the lines that, if the West wants to preserve the liberal world order, it needs to start behaving a different way. Now, why do I lump the Global South together? Because I think really the Global South is going to be the transactional pendulum between the global West and the global East. And in many ways, it's a competition for the hearts and minds of the global West. And of course, from a value perspective, we have the competitive advantage in the West, for instance, in Latin America, just because of the value ties, democracy, and also trade. But is, for instance, someone like Lula behaving in the interest of the global West at the moment? No, it's not. It's doing a completely different story. On Africa, which I think is going to be the deciding continent just because of demographic reality, if you increase your population in 100 years from 1 billion to 4 billion, that is the place which is going to grow, and that is the place which is going to have people at a working age rather than us semi-pensioners or pensioners. Then I think the global South. So my argument is that in the global South you have India, which will have the lead in Asia. You're going to have Saudi Arabia, which is going to take the lead of the global South in the Middle East and the Gulf region. You're going to have South Africa and Nigeria in Africa, and then probably Brazil to a certain extent in Latin America. So it is a simplification, but my argument is that we still need to deal with the countries on their own merit. So therefore, trade agreements between the European Union and Mercosur, et cetera, are quite useful. I would disagree with the hypothesis that people find the term offensive. It's a hell of a lot less offensive than developing countries or poor nations or whatever they have been. So this has been sort of a generic term. Then it can be the global South of Latin America or the global South of Africa. You can change it around, but I'm trying to find order, and that's why I think the global South is at least so far the best one. And to be honest, when you look at the behavior of the global South on the war in Ukraine, I mean, a lot of people took joy in the fact that 141 countries voted to condemn Russian action in the UN. 35 abstained and 4 voted in favor of Russia. Now, the 35 that abstained, they're over half the world's population because they are China and they include China and India. But what people didn't notice is that it's only 40 countries in the world that have actually sanctioned Russia. And remember, this is a country that is in blatant violation of all the basic rules of the United Nations. It is a country which is at the moment slaughtering innocent human beings, men, women, children, and the elderly, only because of its colonial, imperial, revisionist, and aggressive approach. If we allow this without any kind of sanctioning, then I don't think we have a liberal world order. And I think the global South, to a certain extent, has to be one on our side, and we're losing this game.
Thank you very much. I wanted to give the floor to Richard. You wanted to jump in? Okay, so I have 2 other questions.
Okay, I have an absolute deadline in 7 minutes, so.
Okay, so please let's be brief.
Okay, I'll be very fast. Paul Schmidt from the Austrian Society for European Politics. Thank you, Alexander, for your input. The panel before you, but also you yourself mentioned the importance of internal cohesion and unity, in that we see that over time and starting now, cohesion could start to crumble. And your second recommendation was actually make sure that this doesn't happen. We have to contain this. So what are your proposals of how to contain it? Second question, very fast. You're not the only EU nerd here in this room, even if you're not here physically. We have European elections coming up. How do you see these elections, again, in the context of maintaining unity? Thank you.
Okay.
Can I just piggyback a question on that, just to save time? I'm Lane Green. I'm the Spain correspondent for The Economist and also the style chief and language columnist. So I had some role in quashing the use of Global South in that package of articles the other week. So I'm very happy.
Yeah, and I must say that, sorry, I hope The Economist doesn't claim that it has come up with a term or with a thesis, because that thesis has been around for quite a while. But anyway,
we're trying to suppress it, actually. So I wanted to ask, you said show up with, you mentioned kind of admiringly maybe the Chinese who show up with a hospital rather than a lecture, but also talked about this idea of a dignified foreign policy. How do you show up and transact while also bringing these countries to the values that the West stands for? If not lecturing, what exactly is the combination of transactionality And what would you call it if not a lecture?
Okay, good. Those were the two questions, right? Okay, so let me try to dissect the questions in 5 minutes. So the first one was really about unity, both general unity inside the European Union and then European Parliament elections. Now, inside the European Union, there's no magic potion except, hardcore diplomacy and footwork and picking up your phone and doing your messaging and making sure that we get a common line on something. The best example that I've seen in the past years is when Russia asked all OSCE countries separately to provide answers to their rather, how would I say, Russian view on European security. And what Borrell did was to huddle in all the 27 foreign ministers, and specifically Lavrov asked the OSCE members to give separate answers. And then Borrell got together and said, okay, no, we're going to do this together as an EU and provide the answer. Now that's very good, forthright unity. Then, of course, disunity happens inside the European Union, and sometimes it's transactional and it's certainly not value-based. I mean, look, someone like Viktor Orban, you could question whether he's following the rules, regulations, and rules of the game of diplomacy inside the European Union. By the way, just as a side anecdote, I remember once asking Viktor Orban, he said, Viktor, how are you doing? And he's just laughed and said, haha, probably better than I deserve. Well, he's not exactly Mr. Unity, if you know what I mean, inside the European Union. So it's basically making sure that on the big tickets, you get a result. But remember, the EU is also, to a certain extent, a democracy. And in a democracy, you don't always have unity. So stop sort of pretending that we live in some kind of an illusionary utopia where everyone is going to just nod and say, yes, Minister, we all agree. No, we don't. We come to some kind of a compromise. And I always say that the EU advances in 3 phases. First, there is a crisis. Second, there is chaos. And third, there's a suboptimal solution. So begin with the assumption that every solution that's done in unity is suboptimal. On the European elections, there's always screaming and shouting that, oh no, we're going to get more extreme right or more extreme left than this. Well, listen, guys, that's democracy. In democracy, you don't always get what you want. The key is to make sure that the institutions last and you have a clear separation of powers and you come up with decisions. I've actually always said that if you are an active and expert European parliamentarian and you get a big report in your hand, you actually have more power than a minister. So they're always really important elections, and they're always gonna provide gun fodder for anyone who wants to analyze how split it is. But I think the sign of times right now is that we're looking at more disunity inside any form of democratic governance. I just think it's very important that it doesn't get overly polarized, as it is, for instance, at the moment in the United States. Unfortunately, with social media, with algorithms that feed disunity, that's going to be a very difficult feat. So again, important and super interesting elections. On dignified foreign policy, China, values and transactions. You see, I think when you are in office, I was in government for 8 years, you have to take a decision every day between values and interests. And it's always a balance. So all of these people who claim that we need to drive a fully value-based foreign policy, I say that is completely unrealistic. How do you drive a value-based foreign policy and interact with Saudi Arabia or with Iran or with Syria? You just can't do that. So it's the question of, do I provide, for instance, arms to a country which is autocratic but is fighting terrorism, which might create insecurity in the country, right? So you have to make these choices. Now, my point is that it's not a question about ditching your own values, but it's a question about not forcing your values upon someone else. And at the end of the day, if we believe, and I certainly do, that liberal democracy is not the most efficient, but by far the fairest and best form of governance, then we have to lead by example. And when you lead by example, you don't preach. And what we did in Europe is we went on this sort of religious crusade about forcing democracy around the world, including Iraq and other places. And we have to understand it doesn't work. And on top of that, you know, the environment does not know borders or values. We cannot solve the climate crisis without cooperation with the kinds of countries that don't share our values. The same goes with technology. Artificial intelligence is going to change the economy and the way in which we work, politics and the way in which we communicate, war and the way in which we conduct it, and science and the way in which we are as human beings. Now, we have to have a common basic understanding. And if you shut the door and say, listen, I'm not going to talk to you because you are not like me, then we're not going to find a solution. So it's a very careful balance to do. And it's always so much easier to point a finger at someone else rather than having a dialogue with that person, say, okay, how can we solve this problem? I know this is an incomplete answer. Dignified foreign policy is not a magic potion which is going to, solve world peace. But I think it's a good start, because if not, it's going to be the rogue guys running this world. And that's an option which is much worse.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if you have a few more minutes.
I don't, I'm afraid, because I have my next Zoom that started one minute ago.
Okay, so thank you very much. We already stole a lot of your time. So.
My pleasure, and good luck, and sorry for not being there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before moving to different questions, I wanted to give the opportunity to our speakers to react to the intervention of Alexander Stubb. I don't know if you want to say something.
I mean, I think we've ended up talking a bit beyond the presidency. The Spanish presidency is not going to redefine EU geostrategy. It needs some work. I think you're right, Charles. We don't have a good way of framing the debate about how we engage with the rest of the world. Personally, it's a shame not to be able to debate, but I do have a different perspective. I think because of the war, because of these crises, the danger actually is that we drift a little bit too much towards pure transactionalism with the rest of the world. Not actually convinced that's what the rest of the world wants. It sounds a little bit demeaning to the rest of the world. Alex's starting point was that Europe has erred in having this crusade for democracy and in not talking to anyone who doesn't think like us. I don't see it like that. I think the British, the French, the Germans, the Spanish have never had trouble in talking and aiding authoritarian regimes. We've never had problem in supplying arms to Saudi Arabia. Governments don't need encouraging to sell arms to authoritarian governments. I don't think that's the problem. My fear is a little bit the inverse, that because of the strategic imperatives of the war, we are being dragged a little bit too much towards transactionalism. I think too, and also one listens to many interventions like this, the first bit of which is we have to stop lecturing the rest of the world, and then the next bit, as we heard, is Lula has to sign up to our agenda on Ukraine. This is contradictory. In response to the economist question, I do think you can square the circle, because having I think dignified foreign policy is a bad term, personally. I think you can keep the focus on human rights and democratic norms, because these have nothing to do with us as Europeans. The demand for better governance is coming from within societies. We as Europeans are way behind the curve in most countries around the world. And therefore it is not having a kind of modest but consistent support for better standards of governance is not a European agenda. The question is whether Europe can do anything to offer the kind of support that people from within societies want. I think you're right, Charles, Global South is a bad term in that sense. The division between democracies and autocracies is even worse. I'm sure Carlos will know there's no uniformity within Latin America either. I mean, you have Chile on one extreme, then you have Nicaragua and Venezuela. So I'm not sure the regional focus quite works either. So I think we will have what I would call a more kind of modular approach to geostrategy in the future. That requires some diplomatic dexterity from countries like Spain. But I actually think Spain is in a fairly good position to take this kind of agenda forward.
Thank you very much.
Yes, if I may, I want to elaborate a little bit this idea that Charles raised against my remark on the presence of China, And, I wanted to make it short, bringing up this issue of, Lula's positions. Lula's positions are not unrelated to the ties that Lula has, or that Brazil has with China, and are not unrelated to, the composition of the Brazilian parliament and how, the representation of, political groups that have strong ties to the agricultural sector mean for, these relations for China. So, when I said that, Europe has to be there, I want to stress the idea that if it is not there, we are likely to see other ties that help, build other kind of advocacy coalitions that will not necessarily favor our position in the world. So, it is superficial to say, we want to be there to avoid others being there. We want to be there in order to create a milieu in which we will be working more efficiently with them. So I think this is something that we need to think much about. When we are not there, when we don't count, others will be there and will be, playing a role in shaping their politics and shaping their positions in the international order.
Okay, thank you very much for your interventions. I will come back to the European integration because, Richard, you mentioned several times the strengths and weakness of the European Union and the European institutional structure and the need to deepen in the reforms. So, you think that the European Union needs to reform itself, especially before accepting new member states? Is it likely to happen? If not, why? And what should be the role of Spain in this regard?
I think it's a very difficult balance. I went through the point very quickly initially, but I think in a way it's perfectly understandable that at the moment, because of the various crises, the focus has been on very short-term urgent priorities. That's perfectly natural and understandable, and it will be the case during the Spanish presidency. To some extent, events will determine the presidency, but I don't think a presidency can only allow events to determine everything. There has to be some kind of constant underlying, more proactive agenda. And what worries me a little bit is that this agenda on longer-term reform of the European project has got unduly sidelined over the last couple of years for good reasons, but I don't think we can neglect it completely. Everyone here knows, and we've been writing about it a lot, before the war started, the Conference on the Future of Europe was just concluding. It raised a lot of hopes and expectations. I may be unduly critical, but in the year since the conference finished, one doesn't see that a lot has really happened. The citizen panels took place. I mean, the Commission claims that it's following through on the citizen panels. It's difficult really to detect any very tangible institutional reforms, probably for good reason that everyone has been focused on the war. But I do think unless we address these longer-term reforms, some of the shorter-term priorities will also be the importance of cohesion and unity and so on and so forth will also be difficult to address. For me, the EU always faces this catch-22 situation. In the middle of the crisis, there's not enough policy bandwidth to look at the longer-term reform issues. As soon as the crisis goes away, the urgency isn't there to address these underlying reform issues, so they constantly get pushed off into the long grass and never really get fully grasped. I know there are people in the Commission looking at the output from the Conference on the Future of Europe. There are debates about treaty reform and differences over this, but I do think that it will eventually be necessary to pick up some of these issues that were raised in the conference. If we look at it more from an academic point of view, people have been writing for the last few years about how the crisis has prompted a lot of advances in European cooperation, but what they've engineered is a kind of crisis Europe. And again, people in the room have been writing about this, that created an EU that has quite strong or stronger executive-like powers. It's quite a top-down construct. It's about getting certain policy deliverables agreed in the short term because of the seriousness of the crisis. All the other things about making European integration, European cooperation more legitimate, more open, more transparency have been neglected to a certain extent. I know it's a very, very difficult balancing act for governments to get this right, but I do think that those issues do need to be brought back to the table eventually. So it's not just because we know that the EU needs to be reformed if accession is to work successfully, that obliges certain very specific EU reforms to be contemplated. Otherwise, the whole enlargement process will just get atrophied completely. But I think there is this broader agenda of how we strike the right balance between a crisis Europe and a more kind of open citizens Europe. To me, the crisis has veered us a little bit towards the former extreme rather than the latter.
Okay.
So again, in academic, I just try and relate the presidency to the kind of academic issues. This is kind of more of an academic conversation. Is the difference between policy improvements and polity formation, the basic structure of the political system. And I think we must not lose that from sight. Otherwise, it will be more difficult to address some of the policy priorities as well.
But what do you think that Spain could do in this regard? Is there a chance for Spain to make a push, or? So
I don't think it's in Spain's gift to kind of address all these issues, but I do think, I mean, within the modest powers that the presidency has to shape the agenda, it can at least recognize the kind of defects, the imbalances in the current debate. Sitting in Brussels, it's very apparent that the debate about reforming the accession process is a little bit stuck at the moment. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of ideas swirling around about staged accession. Apparently many member states support this, including Spain, France and others, and yet still at the moment there's no really kind of concrete agreement on what this might entail. There's lots of ideas swirling around about a different kind of end point of accession as well, kind of accession without veto powers for a certain time, a limited time period. Again, it seems that some states are favorable towards this kind of ideas, but these kind of ideas are a little bit stuck in the system at the moment. So I think Spain, for all the short-term priorities and the events that undoubtedly will condition the presidency, I would say it can make a contribution if it can help shape these underlying longer-term debates as well.
So, because I was thinking while you were talking, do you think that maybe after the European elections next year, this momentum of talking about reforms that we are living now may be lost or maybe enhanced? Do you think that what could happen after these European elections next year? Because maybe we get lost with defining the new political agenda, the new structure of the Commission, and this debate that we are having now maybe is lost. I don't know if you have.
I don't think that precludes making at least a few modest steps before the elections. I mean, the State of the Union speech last year had several fairly concrete ideas on including citizens, some kind of institutional changes that do not necessarily require treaty change and could be brought to bear. And it's not simply that those issues have not been carried through. I think it's because of the nature of the crisis at the moment. The policy making is becoming much more kind of controlled and top-down, less transparent. And it's not just because of the war, it's because of the issues that Paul was mentioning as well. The unfinished business from the pandemic, where that's taking us, the nature of the RRF, so on and so forth. So there's a kind of there's a kind of cluster of factors that are pushing in this direction. This isn't an original point. It's been well noted by writers that we've got into this kind of crisis Europe that has many strong points. It's what's propelled the European cooperation forward to some extent, but I do think we eventually need a kind of more balanced debate about where the European project is going.
Okay, I wanted to come back to you because you were mentioning the bravery of the Ukrainians defending the rule-based order and the democracy. So it's also linked to the idea of enlargement and deepening. So what should we do with this dossier? Should we think about a fast-track accession, or should we stick on the enlargement process as it is right now? Should we maybe think in much more strategic and foreign affairs terms? I don't know if you have some thoughts about that.
Well, I would never talk about a fast-track accession. I would be more comfortable if we talk about a fast track towards negotiations. You know, there are many disadvantages of going too fast, especially when it comes to accession. You know, double standards cannot be held in the European Union. When I was in Kyiv, you know, even Ukrainians were saying that they have problems in meeting some of the criteria or of the recommendations. You know, they were saying, you know, how we are like the person responsible for you know, European integration in the parliament was saying, you know, how we can deal with the oligarchization in at this point. You know, we are in the middle of a war. If we, you know, open wounds in our country right now, you know, we are basically weakening our capacity to keep fighting. You know, we cannot afford, and they are going far in terms of you know, fighting corruption, which somehow is also creating splits within the country. But you know, it is very difficult to face some challenges when you are in the middle of a war. So that doesn't mean that we should not support like acceleration in, you know, the process of integration. But this acceleration can only take place if with our like full support or with our willingness to you know, stand by them and help them, you know, meet the criteria, but not with offering like a kind of exceptional track towards the integration.
This took me to another issue, the European political community, because we are having these days the second summit in Chisinau. During the Spanish presidency is going to take place the third summit. So I don't know if you fear that maybe this European political community would end to be the waiting room for those candidates. And also because you mentioned in your first intervention this idea of multi-level governance. So I don't know, how do you place this European political community in the multi-level governance? What do you think about it? Is it useful, or is it just going to overlap with the already existing institutions? So maybe you can start and then you continue.
So personally, here I do think Spain can provide a really valuable role in Granada, and hopefully kind of take this forward, and all eyes will be there. I think there's a general consensus that the challenge here is to make sure that the EPC stays distinct from the EU and doesn't get kind of unduly kind of crowded out by the EU debates around the EU acquis, but that it does serve as a kind of strategic umbrella to what's going on in the EU. Well, again, it's a complex balancing act to be separate but strategically consistent with the EU. I think, again, that's because Spain has the kind of dual perspectives. It's played a very kind of strong proactive role on Ukraine, but it has the wider global focus as well. There, I think it can help provide that kind of shaping strategic umbrella, because otherwise I think the danger is that the EPC will last 3 or 4 years, and then its purpose will lose clarity, and it's the momentum behind it could evaporate. So it's a difficult one, but there I think Spain could play a role, because the EPC, there are kind of big continent-wide issues that do need this qualitatively different diplomatic kind of forum, it seems to me, that are quite separate from the kind of EU reform debates that we're having.
Great. You, what do you think?
I completely agree with this perspective. I think we have a challenge to give substance to what is going on there. So we might fail if we are not able to provide some ground to this new structure of governance. But at the same time, I'm very supportive of the idea after seeing, how it is embraced by countries in the process of integration to the European Union. I have been in Moldova talking with, parliamentarians, with like the main political actors there, and they are enthusiastic about this idea. So, given that these countries feel that this helps them, helps them not only in the project of integration, but helps them to legitimate their actions in the domestic sphere. So this helps them, to explain the societies that they are making, they are moving forward, that they are being considered as, a future partner. If they feel that we are providing them, some sense to our process of integration that may take long, because it has always been long for every country. It was long for us as well, and even when it's not long, it feels as long for domestic constituencies and for citizens in every country. So if they are happy, I have no reasons to think this is an idea that we should not bet on.
Okay, so we have some minutes left. So I just wanted to ask you a final question, just a couple of thoughts by both of you. How will you define the success for the Spanish presidency? Do you have an idea or no?
Survival.
Okay. And you?
I would say, I said it before, if we are helpful to keep some spirit of cooperation and unity, if at the end of the semester we are still as united as we are now, even when I accept that there are, some reasons to fear some war fatigue, was Alexander Stubb saying, or if we keep unity at the same level, unity is our main asset in these turbulent new times.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think we have.
Yes, very, very interesting session. Thank you very much. I'm Ernesto Talvi, currently at Elcano, former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Uruguay. I'm a little bit amazed that in this hour and a half of conversation, Latin America appeared, China appeared, and the United States basically appears to be like a side actor in all these drama. So what do you think is the role of the United States and the role of the European presidency vis-a-vis the United States? That would be my question.
Okay.
I mean, this is a huge question that again goes a little bit beyond the presidency, but I would suspect that there will be others who know a lot more than I do about this, and there will be sessions on this. But I think a crucial inflection point for the transatlantic agenda will come with the EU's economic security strategy, because what I see is a tightened transatlantic unity on security issues, to some extent on kind of global order governance issues, but intensified competition and rivalry on the economic and commercial side. And so I think that the economic security strategy that the Commission is due to release will be a kind of touchstone for that element of the transatlantic relationship. But I think in terms of Ukraine, I think that there the transatlantic cooperation is working fairly well, at least beneath the surface. It's not all taking place on an EU-US basis. It's a little bit more varied institutionally. It comes back to this notion of lots of multiple stakeholders and institutions and governments and international institutions being involved. But I think gradually during the course of the Spanish presidency, if we relate it directly to that, I think the domestic trends in the US will come to dominate our attention a lot more as we get a sense of which way the domestic politics is going in the US and the way that may affect Europeans' concerns with Ukraine and the wider European space.
I would add to that, you know, I agree with this idea that this transatlantic relationship has been quite fluid. You know, there are some shadows. We are seeing, you know, increasing concerns about, you know, industrial policy of the United States. So this is a big topic that I don't dare to address now. But I think in the long, you know, broadly, we could say that there are not, this presidency in the United States has not been problematic for Europe. You know, the big issue is what will happen next. So to what extent we will get nervous if we see that that Trump is, you know, leading the polls, if Biden somehow is not, you know, showing that he's going to be a reliable president due to his age. So, you know, the big concern about the United States is probably not popping into our minds now, but it might be the big issue of 2024.
Okay, I think we have another question, so.
Thank you. I have one for each of the speakers, and very short. My name is Sabina Lange. I represent the University of Ljubljana here. One for Marí Klose. Can you single out one thing that the Spanish presidency under a different prime minister would do differently? One thing. And Richard, you mentioned the modular approach. What would be the sticking point in your view? What would be the leitmotif of modular instead of regional, as Alexander suggested he would advocate? Thanks.
Okay, shall I go first? Yeah. Well, you know, I'm a member of the ruling party, so I have very clear understanding of what my government wants to do. I have no such a clear idea of what is in the agenda of a potential government, like especially if it's a coalition of the Conservative Party with the more extreme right party. You know, I would dare to say that you know, social issues that the government wants to bring to the agenda as priorities will not be there. You know, gender concerns will not be there. Climate change, I don't know to what extent would be a priority for, I say, a coalition of the two conservative radical right parties. in the realm of foreign policy, I think there is a, significant overlap, but probably some concepts would not be stressed to the same extent. So you would see probably less attention to strategic autonomy, I would say. You would have probably less enthusiasm about or less optimism about our role as leading actor in this semester. So I don't want to go further since, I'm about to start a campaign and this is not time to... So.
Okay, so Richard?
Very non-politically, I would say. By modular, by the way, I don't hold this to be synonymous with transactionalism or pure pragmatism. I think it's, for me, the future of the global order will be very complicated. There'll be different dynamics across different sectors. So I don't think it makes sense to talk about a single form of global order in the future. There'll be certain dynamics of cooperation and multilateral coordination in climate or the economy, and those will be quite different from the tech sector or industrial policy. So I think we need to get used to thinking in those modular terms rather than there being a single uniform kind of global order. I think the main barrier to that is probably still the EU's tendency to think in terms of these big regional frameworks, that we want a policy with Latin America, we want a policy with the Mediterranean, we want a policy with the Indo-Pacific. And so all the variations within those regions tend to get lost from sight. And the EU is perhaps, again, not kind of quite agile enough to deal fully with all those variations. I appreciate the External Action Service. Diplomats would deny that that's the case, that they are beginning to think in this more kind of tailored, specific approach. But it does seem to me there's still a long way to go to reach that in full.
Okay, so I am afraid we are run out of time. Thank you very much for being with us here today. Thank you to Pau, thank you to Richard. A lot of food for thoughts for all of us, so thank you very much.